It was supposed to be just another Wednesday. The classroom buzzed with low chatter, a few pencils tapping restlessly against desks, sneakers squeaking across the worn linoleum floor. Outside, clouds gathered like a storm was on its way, and maybe it was, though no one expected it to hit right there, in room 217, during second period. Mr. Chandler, the AP English teacher, stood at the front of the room, holding a piece of chalk like it was a conductor's baton. His gray hair was always a bit too wild for someone who taught literature, but his mind was sharp and his questions sharper. "All right, here's one for you thinkers," he said, turning to the board. "Why does Atticus Finch say, 'You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it'?" A few students groaned. "Too early for this, Mr. C," someone muttered from the back. Mr. Chandler chuckled. "Come on. Who's got something real to say?" Silence stretched like an awkward pause in a play. Then, the snickering began, soft at first, like the ripple of wind before a storm. Eyes slowly turned, almost in unison, toward the same desk in the second row near the window. Micah. He sat still, head slightly down, black hoodie pulled just enough to shadow his expression. His notebook was open, neat handwriting filling every line like he was writing to someone who actually cared. Micah never spoke unless forced. Never raised his hand. And never, ever laughed with the rest of them. "Yo," one kid whispered loud enough for half the class to hear. Maybe the quiet genius has an answer. Or maybe he's just sketching anime again. That set off laughter. Another voice, "Bet he's writing a love letter to his hoodie." Even Mr. Chandler gave a tight smile, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment pass. He cleared his throat. "Micah," he asked, almost gently. "What do you think?" The room fell quiet. The kind of quiet that buzzes with expectation and cruelty. No one expected him to speak. That was the game. Micah, the ghost. Micah, the silent. Micah, the joke. He looked up. His eyes were calm. Deep brown, almost glassy. He glanced at Mr. Chandler, then slowly closed his notebook, as if making peace with something inside himself. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady. "I think. Atticus says that because empathy is inconvenient. Most people would rather judge than understand. It's easier. Safer. But it's also what keeps us divided. Because nobody wants to wear shoes that don't fit their image." The laughter stopped. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to hum differently. Micah wasn't done. He lifted his gaze, this time scanning the room. Most people don't want to understand. They want to feel superior. They want to laugh. Like right now. Y'all didn't really care about the answer. You just needed someone to point fingers at, so you wouldn't have to answer anything real. A long breath filled the silence. No one spoke. Not even the class clown in the back with his mouth half open like he was still catching up. Mr. Chandler blinked, his mouth moving before words came. "Micah, that's something." Then Rachel, the girl with strawberry blonde curls and a quiet kindness that didn't scream for attention, gave a small nod. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Micah opened his notebook again like nothing had happened and began to write. No applause. No cheers. Just a moment. But it changed everything. By lunch, the whispers had already started. Did you hear what Micah said in English? He actually talked. It was deep. Like, goosebumps, bro. But the tone wasn't mocking anymore. It was confused. Curious. And Micah? He didn't seem to care. He sat alone at the far table like always, eating a sandwich packed by a mom who worked night shifts at the hospital. He pulled out his dog-eared copy of The Souls of Black Folk and started reading as if his whole identity hadn't just shifted in the minds of his peers. Still, eyes kept drifting toward him. Some with wonder. Some with suspicion. A few with guilt. But not everyone was impressed. "Whatever," said Jaden, a popular junior known for being charming and cruel in equal measure. He probably rehearsed that in the mirror for a week. Bet his mom clapped when he practiced. Laughter, forced this time. But even Jaden looked uncertain. Mr. Chandler sat in the teacher's lounge staring at his mug. He'd been teaching for 22 years. He thought he'd seen every kind of student: loud, quiet, brilliant, lazy, troubled, lost. But Micah didn't fit any box. That answer, it wasn't just good. It was real. Too real. He opened his laptop and typed the moment into his lesson log, still trying to process what he felt. Micah's words echoed in his mind: empathy is inconvenient. He rubbed his eyes. What kind of pain did a kid have to go through to say something like that? That night, Micah sat on his porch steps while the wind picked up. His mom's car hadn't pulled into the driveway yet. Probably running overtime again. He didn't mind. He liked the quiet. It was the only place no one expected him to be anything other than himself. His phone buzzed. New message, unknown number. That thing you said today? About judging and understanding? I've never heard anyone say it like that. Thanks. Micah stared at the message for a long time before locking the screen. He didn't smile. But something in his chest settled. A little less weight. A little more room to breathe. And just like that, something had shifted. A thread had been pulled loose in the fabric of routine, and the unraveling had begun. No one knew it yet. But this wasn't the end of Micah's moment. It was the beginning of his rise. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The first time Micah understood the power of silence, he was 8 years old. It was a Saturday morning. The sun had just cracked through the clouds above their tiny South Side Chicago apartment, and the air smelled like grits and bacon from the neighbor's kitchen downstairs. His dad, back then still alive, still whole, was sitting on the worn couch with Micah on his lap, teaching him how to tie a tie. "You don't gotta talk loud to be heard," his father had said, looping the fabric around gently. "Some folks shout because they ain't got nothing real to say. But when you know something deep, you let the silence do some of the talking." That was one of the last real conversations they ever had. 2 weeks later, his father was gone, victim of a drive-by shooting while walking home from his night job at the corner store. Wrong place, wrong time. No suspects. No justice. Just a folded American flag and a lifetime of silence that stretched out in front of Micah like an endless hallway. Micah hadn't spoken much since. He still talked to his mom, of course. She was the glue holding it all together, working double shifts at the hospital, still coming home and sitting on the edge of his bed just to ask how school was, even when her eyes screamed exhaustion. Her name was Sharon Jacobs, and in Micah's world, she was equal parts nurse, therapist, chef, counselor, and guardian angel. She didn't push him to talk. She just listened, even when he wasn't saying anything out loud. "Your eyes," she'd say, brushing his hair back, "they always tell me more than your mouth ever could." There were no pictures of vacations on their walls. No annual trips to Disney World. But there were books. Dozens of them, stacked on shelves, nightstands, the bathroom counter. Baldwin, Angelou, Coates, Plato, Morrison, King. Words became Micah's closest friends, the only ones that didn't laugh or leave or expect him to be someone else. At school, things weren't so kind. By 3rd grade, Micah already had the reputation, that weird, quiet black kid. Not angry. Not disruptive. Just, invisible. He once cried during a group presentation when the teacher made him read aloud. The words blurred together on the page as his heart slammed against his ribs like it was trying to break free. One of the other kids, David, he remembered, snorted and said, "Is he crying 'cause he forgot how to read?" Everyone laughed. After that, he stopped volunteering. Stopped raising his hand. Stopped giving them ammo. Instead, Micah learned to observe. He became a master of watching from the edges, seeing things people didn't realize they were showing. The way Brianna bit her nails when she lied. How Jaden's jokes got meaner when he felt ignored. How teachers sometimes looked through you when your skin was a shade too dark and your clothes were a size too tight. Micah noticed everything. And he remembered. There was one person, years before Rachel, who saw him. Her name was Ms. Elkins, a fifth-grade librarian with cat-eye glasses and a southern drawl that made everything she said feel like a lullaby. "Micah Jacobs," she'd whisper when he entered the library, "I saved a book just for you." She gave him his first Toni Morrison. Taught him how to write his name in cursive with pride. Let him stay late after school to read when he didn't want to go home to silence. She called him an old soul in a young vessel. He never forgot that. But she moved away after just one semester. Micah didn't say goodbye. He never did with people who left. Now 17, he'd learned how to navigate the world on his own terms. He walked through crowded hallways with headphones on but no music playing, just a buffer between him and everyone else. People saw the hoodie, the silence, the way he carried himself like he didn't need anybody, and assumed he was just another aloof teenager trying to be edgy. They didn't see the boy who cried at eulogies he found online. Or the son who left notes in his mother's lunchbox that said, "Don't skip your break today. I love you." Or the student who read Descartes and Dubois with equal reverence. Micah wasn't emotionless. He just kept his emotions in places people didn't know how to look. He didn't hate the kids who laughed at him. Not really. Pity, maybe. But not hate. He knew most of them weren't cruel. Just clueless. Rachel had once said something interesting in biology class during a partner assignment. "I think most people confuse volume with value. Like, the louder you are, the more important you must be." Micah had glanced at her then, really looked. And for the first time, she didn't look away. There were more like her out there, he believed. People who listened before they judged. Who sat in silence not because they had nothing to say, but because they were waiting to say something that mattered. He just hadn't found many of them yet. That night, after the Atticus Finch incident, in English class, Micah sat in his room staring at the ceiling, his notebook open on his lap. He didn't write about what happened. Not directly. Instead, he wrote about stillness. Stillness is a language. The breath between thoughts. The heartbeat between chaos. It speaks. You just gotta listen. He paused, tapping the edge of the page with his pen. Then he added. "I didn't mean to say all that today. But maybe it needed to be said." Micah wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just had enough. Enough of being treated like background noise. Enough of being measured only by the space he didn't take up. Enough of pretending he didn't feel everything 10 times deeper than the people who laughed the loudest. He didn't want applause. He wanted to be seen. And for the first time in years, he thought maybe, just maybe, someone finally had. By Friday, the dust should have settled. That's how it usually worked at Bridgeview High. Something big happened, people whispered about it for 2 or 3 days, maybe posted a TikTok or two, and then moved on to the next minor drama. A hallway breakup. A cafeteria fight. A teacher meltdown. But Micah's moment didn't fade. It lingered. Like a crack in the surface that people couldn't stop staring at, unsure whether it was dangerous, or just something they'd never noticed before. "They're calling him Malcolm Micah now," someone snorted near the lockers, not bothering to whisper. "That was one good answer," said another. "Doesn't mean he's all that." Even when he wasn't around, Micah's name buzzed in the air like static. And when he was around, the vibe changed. He could feel it, people watching him differently. Some with curiosity, some with thinly veiled mockery, and a few with resentment. As if he'd stepped outside the box they'd drawn for him and now they didn't know what to do with him. There was one thing worse than being invisible. Being redefined without your permission. "Yo, preacher boy," Jaden said one morning, sauntering up to Micah's locker like he owned the air around him. "Heard you dropped some MLK-level wisdom in English. You write that yourself, or was that your mom's speech from her job at Walgreens?" Micah didn't respond. He grabbed his book for first period, shut his locker, and turned to leave. But Jaden wasn't finished. "I'm serious, bro, real deep. Real poetic. Just, not really you feel me?" Micah paused. Turned slowly. "I don't need you to feel me," he said, voice flat. "I'm not asking for permission." Jaden smirked, eyes scanning him like he was dissecting something. "Right," he said, before walking off. "Keep talking. We'll see how far that gets you." At lunch, the air was thick with tension. Micah sat alone as usual. He didn't want pity company. Didn't want forced conversation. But now, there was a strange silence in the cafeteria near his table. Not hostility. Not exactly. Just, unsettling attention. The way some teachers looked at him now too, like they weren't sure whether to be impressed or suspicious. Like they were waiting for him to either fail spectacularly or rise too fast. It wasn't admiration. It was surveillance. Micah could feel the weight of the labels tightening around him again. Not just from students. From everyone. The quiet kid. The smart black kid. The unexpected voice. The threat. He remembered something his mom once told him. "They don't just want to name you, baby. They want to claim you. Box you. Tell your story before you get a chance to. So what do I do? You write your own damn label." That night, Micah stared at his ceiling again, replaying the week in his mind. He'd cracked something open in himself, but the air rushing in wasn't all clean. It was full of judgment, doubt, and old wounds. In his notebook, he scribbled. "I was quiet because they didn't deserve my words. Now I speak, and they're trying to make me their idea of me. Again. Still not listening." Monday brought a new wave of tension. Mr. Chandler put Micah's quote on the whiteboard, his exact words from the class discussion. "Empathy is inconvenient." Then he wrote, "Discuss, do you agree or disagree?" That was it. No names. But everyone knew. Micah sat in the third row this time. Eyes forward. Arms crossed. Rachel turned around and gave him a quick glance, concerned, encouraging. Jaden raised his hand. "Well," he said, smirking. "Some people just say deep stuff for attention. Doesn't make it true." Mr. Chandler opened his mouth, but Micah spoke first. "Some people try to be loud so they don't have to be true." The class froze. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone. Dead calm. Precise. No anger. No fear. Jaden flinched, just slightly. But Micah saw it. So did Rachel. After class, she caught up with him in the hallway. "Hey," she said, breath short. "You okay?" He shrugged. "Yeah. You want to come sit with me at lunch today?" Micah hesitated. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Rachel said. "But I want to." He did. And just like that, everything changed again. Because now it wasn't just a story about the quiet kid who said one smart thing. Now he had someone sitting next to him. And that scared them more. Mr. Chandler always said that writing wasn't just about words, it was about truth. So when he announced the semester writing competition, no one was surprised. "The theme is perspective," he said, pacing in front of the class like he was revealing the next Oscar category. It's optional, but the top 5 essays will be published in the school journal. One winner gets a feature in the Tri-State Teen Voices literary issue. And a cash prize. That last part made some heads turn. But not Micah's. He kept doodling in the corner of his notebook, pretending he wasn't listening. But the word perspective echoed in his chest like a slow drum. He could already feel the essay forming. Not in sentences. In moments. In memories. Micah hadn't ever entered a competition before. Too much attention. Too much pressure. Too much risk. But this time, something in him needed to speak. Not just once in a classroom. Not just one viral quote. He needed to tell his story his way. That night, he sat at his desk long after midnight, the hum of the city outside like a lullaby. He started typing. Not fast. But sure. The title came to him last. The Shape of Silence. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't preachy. It was a portrait. Of a father gone too soon. Of a mother who never stopped trying. Of teachers who underestimated. Of students who judged. Of moments where he chose stillness over survival. And of one day, just one, when he spoke up and changed everything. He didn't tell anyone he submitted it. Not even Rachel. A week later, Chandler walked into class holding a stack of papers like they were gold bricks. He scanned the room with a poker face. I read every submission, he said. Most of them were good. Some were forgettable. Then he looked directly at Micah. One was unforgettable. A slow ripple moved through the room like electricity. Jaden rolled his eyes. Rachel straightened in her seat. Micah didn't move. Micah Jacobs, Chandler said. Congratulations. Your essay's being published. And you won. Micah blinked. He hadn't even known he wanted to win until he heard those words. The room exploded in whispers. The quiet kid won. Over everyone. Again. Rachel found him after class. You won, she said, eyes wide. You actually, Micah, that's huge. He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. I didn't write it to win, he said softly. I know. That's why it's good. By the time the journal dropped the next Monday, everything changed again. Copies circulated like wildfire. Students actually read his essay. Not just skimmed it, but paused. Reflected. Some teachers stopped him in the hallways. One counselor cried. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore. He was Micah Jacobs, the writer. But attention is a double-edged sword. And not everyone celebrated. Especially not Jaden. He think he's special now. Jaden muttered to his crew during lunch. Just 'cause he strung together some sob story for a pity prize. Micah heard it. Pretended he didn't. But that night, he couldn't sleep. Because it wasn't just a story. It was his. And now it was out in the world, raw, vulnerable, exposed. And being dismissed like it was a performance. Micah sat on the fire escape, hoodie pulled tight around him, staring out into the glowing night sky. His phone buzzed. New message from Rachel. You don't have to carry their hate. You're too full of purpose to shrink now. He stared at it a long time. Typed. Erased. Typed again. I didn't know people could see me like that. Then maybe they're finally catching up to who you've always been. The next day, Jaden cornered him near the science lab. I read your little essay, he said, voice low. Micah didn't flinch. Cool. Jaden leaned closer. You think just 'cause you can write, you're better than us now? Micah stared at him, eyes calm. No. I think I stopped pretending I was smaller than I am. For once, Jaden had nothing to say. That was the beginning of something bigger. Micah didn't just win a contest. He claimed a voice. And the school? It couldn't unhear him now. Some nights, Micah swore he could still hear his father's voice. Not like a ghost. Not like a memory, exactly. But like a vibration, deep in his bones, whispering through the silence, when the world slowed down and no one was asking him to explain anything. It had been nearly 10 years, but the ache never really left. It just learned how to hide better. Some days, it was tucked between the pages of a book. Other days, in the rhythm of footsteps down a hallway where no one waited at the end. And some days, like this one, it rose without warning, filling his chest with something sharp and old. It started with a photo. Micah had come home early that day. The sun poured through the window in soft gold streaks as he searched for a charger in the bottom of the hallway drawer. But instead, his fingers brushed a thin frame wrapped in cloth. He knew what it was without looking. Still, he unwrapped it like it might fall apart. His father. Back when he was alive. Smiling. Holding Micah in one arm, a toy truck in the other. Micah was 4. Gap-toothed and giggling. His father wore a navy blue uniform from the store he worked at. Harrison's Market. No bulletproof vest. No protection. Just a man doing what he could for his family. Micah's throat tightened. He sat on the floor with the frame in his lap, the silence of the apartment pressing in like a wave. His mom came home late that night. Her scrubs were wrinkled, eyes heavy from a double shift. But she smiled when she saw him sitting at the table. "You eat?" she asked, dropping her keys into the bowl near the door. "Yeah. There's leftovers for you." She walked over, kissed his forehead, then saw the photo beside his notebook. "Oh," she said, her voice catching just slightly. "I didn't mean to," Micah started. "No, baby," she said gently. "You're allowed to remember." They sat together for a while, the photo between them. "Do you ever still hear him?" Micah asked. His mother looked at him for a long time. "Sometimes," she said. "Usually when I'm most tired. Or scared. He says the same thing every time." "What?" She smiled, soft and sad. "You're doing better than you think." Micah didn't cry that night. He wrote instead. "My father was never a superhero. He didn't leave behind riches or a name on a building. He left silence. But not the kind that hurts. The kind that listens. I wonder what he'd think if he saw me now. Speaking. Being heard. Standing up even when I want to run. Would he be proud? Or would he think I took too long to start?" He stopped writing when the page got blurry. The next day at school, Micah was quieter than usual. Not withdrawn, just introspective. Rachel noticed. "You okay?" she asked as they walked toward English. "Yeah," he said. Then added, "Just thinking about someone I haven't talked to in a while." Rachel didn't press. She just nodded. Sometimes the past sneaks up when it knows you're strong enough to face it. Micah looked at her, wondering how someone could say something like that without even flinching. "You ever lost someone?" he asked. "My brother," she said. "He was 15. Skateboarding accident." "I'm sorry." "Me too." They didn't say anything else. They didn't have to. Mr. Chandler had a guest speaker that day. A local author, Devin Brooks, a former Bridgeview High student who had made it out and published 2 books before 25. He was tall, confident, and charismatic in a way that made people lean forward without realizing it. "I wasn't supposed to succeed," Devin told the class. "I was the statistic. The problem kid. Teachers expected me to fight, not write. Until one day, I stopped letting them write my story for me." He looked right at Micah. "You look like someone who understands what that feels like." The class turned toward Micah. Not mockingly. Just curious. Micah held Devon's gaze and nodded once. It was a moment. Another one. After the bell rang, Devon found Micah in the hallway. You Micah? Yeah. I read your piece. The essay. Micah blinked. You read it? Man, Devon said, grinning. That was truth. Not just talent. Real heart. Micah couldn't speak. I didn't write my first honest piece until I was in college, Devon said. You're already ahead. Don't stop. Then he walked away. Micah stood still in the middle of the hallway. His heart wasn't racing. It was steady. Confident. His father's voice, buried so long, echoed again. You don't gotta talk loud to be heard. Micah had always wondered if he was becoming someone new, or finally becoming who he was always meant to be. Now he knew. Micah used to think that silence kept him safe. He didn't talk much, didn't stand out, didn't draw attention, because attention could twist fast. One wrong look. One misunderstood tone. One teacher who thought your silence meant rebellion instead of restraint. But now he wasn't invisible anymore. He was seen. And the spotlight wasn't warm. It started with the office summons. Micah Jacobs to the front office. His name crackled over the PA right before third period. Whispers followed him down the hall. Rachel looked at him with a soft frown, mouthing, "Everything okay?" He shrugged. When he got to the office, the assistant principal, Mr. Dean, was waiting. "Have a seat, Micah," he said, too calmly. Micah sat. Hands still. Face unreadable. "There's been some concern," Mr. Dean said, folding his hands like he was about to deliver a sermon. "You've had a few students mention that your recent essay, well, it stirred up some uncomfortable emotions. Some students felt, called out." Micah blinked. Once. Slowly. "I didn't name anyone." "Sure," Mr. Dean said. "But sometimes, intent and impact don't match." Micah stared at the wall. That phrase, intent and impact, had been thrown at him before. Usually when he did nothing wrong. Usually when someone wanted to remind him he was still being watched. "Look," Mr. Dean continued, "you're clearly very bright. Talented. But with visibility comes responsibility. Your words carry weight now. Just be mindful. Mindful." Micah heard the real message. Stay in your lane. Don't make the wrong people uncomfortable. He nodded slowly. "May I go now?" Mr. Dean leaned back. "Of course." Rachel met him after school. "You okay?" "Just a talk," he said flatly. "What kind of talk?" "The kind where they smile while telling you to shrink." She exhaled. "God. I hate that." Later that night, Micah sat in his room, notebook open, hands still. He wrote nothing. He just stared. He thought about all the kids who got dragged into offices for speaking truth. For expressing pain. For daring to be more than what was expected. He thought about how visibility, for a black kid, wasn't always a victory. Sometimes it was just a clearer target. The next week, things got worse. A hallway poster promoting the school journal was mysteriously defaced. Someone crossed out Micah's name with black marker. Wrote, "Try hard," and "Teacher's Pet," in blocky letters underneath. Another poster had, "Fake woke," scribbled on it. Micah didn't say anything. Not to Mr. Chandler. Not to his mom. Not even to Rachel. He just tore them down and walked away. But inside, something started to harden. He stopped answering in class. Stopped walking with Rachel to lunch. He felt himself slipping back into the shadows, where it was safer, even if it was lonelier. Then Chandler called on him in English again. "Micah, you've been quiet lately. What did you think of the chapter we just read? Micah hesitated. I think people like pretending they're listening, he said finally. But they're really just waiting for something they can criticize. A long silence followed. Then Chandler said, "That's the most honest thing I've heard all week." Micah didn't feel proud. He just felt tired. That night, Rachel messaged him. "You're pulling away." "Why?" "I didn't sign up to be a symbol," he replied. "I just wanted to speak. Once. But what you said mattered. And it still matters. Doesn't feel like it. Not when they're still trying to erase it. You can't let them. You're not just someone who spoke up once. You're someone who makes people listen." Micah stared at her words for a long time. He didn't reply. But he didn't delete them either. That Friday, something shifted. It wasn't big. But it was real. During group presentations in history, Micah was placed with two classmates, Ellie and Carlos, neither of whom had ever really talked to him before. They were supposed to cover the civil rights movement. "Micah," Ellie said, "you want to do the part about the Freedom Riders?" He blinked. "Actually," Carlos added, "I read your essay. It kind of hit. I'd be down to hear your take on that part." Micah stared at them. They weren't mocking. They weren't scared. They were asking. He nodded once. "Yeah. I'll do it." Carlos grinned. "Cool. Let's make it good." That night, Micah opened his notebook again. He finally wrote. "When silence stops being safe, you have to decide, are you surviving, or are you shrinking? I've survived long enough. Now it's time to speak, again." Micah wasn't used to being seen. Not in the way people truly saw you, unfiltered, honest, without judgment. For most of his life, people either ignored him or saw what they wanted. But Ellie and Carlos, of all people, had asked him to step forward. To speak his truth, not because it was their project, but because they saw something in him. That made all the difference. It started on that Friday, when they were working on their history presentation in the library. The others were scattered around the room, working on their sections, but Micah, Ellie, and Carlos were stuck in their corner, near the big windows, where the afternoon sun shone through the leaves outside. Micah was explaining his section, talking about the Freedom Riders and their courage to stand up for what was right, even in the face of violence. His voice was steady. His words came easily, even though his heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he was drowning in expectations. It just felt like a conversation. Then Ellie spoke up. "Micah," she said, her eyes wide with something that looked like awe, "you really get it. Like, you get what this means." Her words weren't a compliment. They were an acknowledgement, a recognition of the depth of what he was sharing. Carlos, sitting beside her, added, "Yeah. I've read about this stuff in books, but I never really thought about the people who were living it. You made it real." Micah paused. "It's real. It happened. It's still happening." They both went quiet for a moment. Micah could see the gears turning in their minds, as if the weight of his words had actually sunk in. The next day, things felt different. Micah had come into school, still holding on to that small flicker of hope from the night before. Ellie and Carlos didn't just see him, they respected his voice. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to that. In English class, they were tasked with breaking into groups to discuss the themes of the novel they were reading. Micah was paired with Ellie, and they sat quietly at the back of the room, starting to dissect the text. Ellie turned to him. "Hey, I know this might sound weird, but do you want to talk about something?" Micah blinked, thrown off by the directness. Sure. What's up?" Ellie leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "I just want to say. I get it. The way you feel. The essay. All of it." Micah sat back, confused. What do you mean? She hesitated before speaking again. Look, I get that I'm not in the same shoes as you. But I do understand what it feels like to be the one no one pays attention to have everyone else's voice be louder. And I just want you to know, I'm here. I see you. Micah's heart stuttered. It wasn't the usual awkward empathy he got from people who felt sorry for him, or the judgment from others who thought he was just a quiet kid. It was something else. By the end of the class, Ellie had turned to him once more, her tone light but sincere. I've got your back, she said. We're in this together, all right? The weight that Micah had been carrying, the quiet loneliness of being invisible, seemed to lift a little. It wasn't enough to fix everything. The whispers. The judgment. The constant reminder that being black meant that his silence was a safety net, but being heard came with consequences. But this? This was different. That afternoon, Carlos caught him in the hallway. Hey, man, he said, eyes serious but friendly. I just wanted to say, I really respect how you've handled all this. I know it's not easy, especially with some of the stuff people are saying. Micah stared at him, unsure how to respond. It's not easy. Carlos nodded, his expression unwavering. Yeah. I get that. Just, don't let them make you think you don't deserve to be heard. I know what it's like to be treated like you don't matter. Micah tilted his head, surprised. You. Carlos gave a small shrug. I'm not exactly a poster child for popular. But I get why you stay quiet. Sometimes it feels like no matter what you say, it's wrong, you know. Micah swallowed. Yeah. Carlos smiled, the first real smile Micah had seen from him. Well, I don't think you're wrong. You've got a voice for a reason, man. And just like that, the weight that had been pressing on Micah, so heavy, so suffocating, shifted, if only slightly. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore. He was Micah. Rachel noticed too. After the class bell rang, she waited by Micah's locker, her arms folded as if she had something to say. You were quiet today, she said, a small smirk playing on her lips. I guess I was, Micah replied, pausing before he added, Ellie and Carlos, they're different. Different how? They listen. Like, they actually get it. Rachel raised an eyebrow. They see you? Micah nodded. Yeah. It's not just pity. Or curiosity. They get it. That's big. Rachel's smile widened. I'm glad. You deserve it. Micah looked at her. Maybe I do. That evening, as Micah sat at his desk, writing in his notebook, the words came a little easier. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't writing to hide. He was writing to be understood. To be seen. And it felt different. He wrote. When you stop hiding your truth, you can start sharing it. And when you start sharing it, you might find that people are listening. It's not easy, but maybe it's worth it. Micah had hoped things would get better. But as the days passed, the silence he had carefully cultivated began to crack. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. It wasn't just the subtle isolation he had grown used to. It was the way people looked at him now, like he was a symbol, not a person. And people didn't always treat symbols with kindness. Monday morning started with another note on his desk. Freak. Stay in your lane. Micah stared at the note for a long time. It was short. It was blunt. And it was exactly the kind of thing he had been bracing for ever since he'd dared to speak his truth in class. Someone was watching, waiting to remind him that standing out wasn't always a win. He crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash. During history class, Mr. Chandler asked the group to give a presentation on civil rights. Micah stood up with Ellie and Carlos, their project now polished and refined, their voices confident as they explained the stories of people who had fought for change. But the words felt heavier than usual. The eyes on him felt hotter. When it was his turn to speak, he looked around the room. Rachel gave him an encouraging nod. Ellie smiled softly. Carlos looked at him with a glimmer of solidarity. But then his gaze landed on the back of the room, where a group of jocks sat, all with their arms folded, sneering just a little too obviously. Micah's throat went dry. He felt the weight of their judgment more than ever. He took a deep breath and continued. His voice was steady, but there was something different in the air now. The moment had shifted. People weren't just listening. They were waiting for him to fail. As the bell rang, Micah gathered his things quickly. He didn't want to linger. Not today. But as he turned toward the door, he collided with someone. Tyler. Micah recoiled immediately, instinctively shrinking back. "Watch where you're going, Jacobs," Tyler sneered, a nasty edge in his voice. Micah was about to apologize and slip away when Tyler's next words stopped him. "You know, people like you shouldn't be so loud," he said, low and menacing. "I don't know who you think you are, but this school doesn't need another one of you thinking they're better than everyone else." Micah's heart skipped a beat. His fists clenched. Why did it always have to be like this? Why couldn't he just exist without being made to feel like he was out of place? But Tyler wasn't done. "You've got your little crew now. You're allies." Tyler air-quoted the word as if it was something ridiculous. "But you don't belong here. You don't fit in. So don't get too comfortable, all right?" Micah's mouth went dry. He wanted to shout back, to tell Tyler that he didn't care what he thought, but the words got stuck in his throat. Instead, he just nodded, a quick, sharp movement, before he walked away. Later that day, Rachel found him alone in the cafeteria. "You good?" she asked, looking at him with concern. Micah didn't know how to answer. He wasn't good. He was never good when Tyler or anyone from that side of the school decided to make him their target. "Just tired," he muttered, trying to brush it off. Rachel didn't buy it. "Micah, this is bigger than just schoolwork, isn't it?" He didn't say anything. It was bigger. It was always bigger. He just couldn't put it into words. That afternoon, Micah sat on the steps outside, his thoughts swirling. People kept looking at him differently. Not just the kids who had always ignored him, but the ones who had supported him, Ellie, Carlos, Rachel. It felt like they were all stepping back a little. And he didn't blame them. It wasn't easy being around him now. Not when he had made himself a target. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the schoolyard, Tyler and his crew walked past him, laughing loudly. Tyler's gaze flicked to him, then away, but Micah didn't miss the smirk. The challenge. He had made himself visible. But now he had to wonder, was it worth it? Later that evening, Micah sat at his desk again, staring at his notebook. Ellie had texted him earlier, something short and supportive, "Don't listen to them. You've got this." But the message didn't ease the weight pressing down on his chest. He flipped open his notebook and started writing. "Sometimes, speaking your truth feels like walking through fire. The first step is always the hardest, but the real struggle begins when the flames keep coming. I thought being heard would make everything better. Maybe it's just the beginning of something harder." The next day, things got worse. During gym class, Micah noticed the stares. Tyler and his friends were laughing. Throwing glances his way. Whispering just loud enough for him to hear. That's when he noticed the first real crack in his support system. Ellie and Carlos weren't sitting with him at lunch. They were sitting with the popular kids. It didn't feel like a betrayal at first. But when Micah walked by them, and Ellie didn't even glance up, a small part of him broke. They weren't part of his world anymore. Or maybe he wasn't part of theirs. Micah grabbed his lunch tray and sat alone in the corner. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Rachel. "Hey, I know it's been rough. But just know that I'm here, okay? He didn't respond. Not because he didn't appreciate the support, but because there was something deeper now. Something shifting inside of him. The divide had grown wider. It wasn't just between him and Tyler anymore, it was between him and everyone else. As Micah looked around the cafeteria, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The divide was getting bigger. And he had to figure out if he was willing to stand on one side of it. Or if he was going to find a way to bridge it. Micah didn't expect the silence to hurt so much. It wasn't the quiet of being alone that he was used to. No, this was different. This was the silence between him and the people he once trusted, the ones who had once been there without question. It was an uncomfortable silence that stretched across the room whenever he tried to speak, like an invisible wall between him and everyone else. That Tuesday, everything felt off. Micah sat in the back of his history class, his mind drifting. Mr. Chandler was talking about the civil rights movement again, but Micah's thoughts weren't on the lesson. They were on Ellie and Carlos. They'd been so supportive at first, rallying behind him when he had stood up to give his presentation. But now they barely acknowledged him in the halls. Ellie had been distant. Carlos, too. It felt like they were all avoiding him. Was it his fault? Micah glanced up from his notebook and caught Carlos looking at him from across the room. He didn't smile. He didn't even wave. It was just a long, heavy stare before Carlos quickly turned his gaze back to his phone. Later that day, Micah sat at the cafeteria table with his tray, picking at his food, but his appetite was gone. The usual noise of the cafeteria felt dull, muted, like he was outside of it, observing rather than participating. He scanned the room, searching for Ellie and Carlos, but they were nowhere to be seen. In their place, the popular kids had taken over the seats where Ellie and Carlos usually sat. Tyler and his friends were at their usual table, laughing, as always. But this time, Micah wasn't the joke. It felt like that was a new low, a subtle, lingering tension that didn't need words to be understood. Tyler didn't need to say anything for Micah to know that the divide had deepened. Ellie had texted him that morning, just 2 words, "Sorry, Micah." Sorry for what? Micah wondered. For the way she had become distant? For the way she didn't sit with him anymore? Or was it just the silence, the space between them, that made her uncomfortable? Micah stared at the screen for a long time. He wanted to reply, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he shoved his phone into his bag and stood up to leave. The silence was louder than anything she could say. By the time he made it to English class, Micah felt like he was suffocating. Ellie was at her desk, chatting with some other students. Carlos was across the room, talking with his new group of friends. He wanted to be part of it, to somehow reclaim the closeness they once shared, but he didn't know how to break through the invisible wall between them. When the bell rang for the start of class, Mr. Timmons called for everyone to settle down. Micah slipped into his seat, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. Ellie glanced at him, but it wasn't the same glance. She didn't look at him like she used to, with understanding or kindness. There was a hint of unease now, and it made Micah's heart sink. That afternoon, Rachel found him in the library. "You okay?" she asked softly as she sat down next to him. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in her eyes that showed she knew what he was feeling. "I don't know," Micah replied, shaking his head. "It's like, everything's changing. I thought they'd get it. I thought they'd be on my side." Rachel tilted her head slightly, watching him with empathy. "People don't always get it, Micah. Not the way you want them to. But that doesn't mean you're wrong." Micah sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. It feels like I'm losing everyone. Ellie. Carlos. Everyone. Maybe not everyone, Rachel said gently. Maybe just them. Sometimes, standing up for what you believe in means losing people. And that's hard. But it's not the end. Micah wasn't sure what to say to that. He didn't want to lose his friends, but the distance between them was starting to feel unbridgeable. And with every passing day, the silence grew. That night, Micah sat in his room, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. He tried to tell himself it was just a phase, that things would get better, that Ellie and Carlos would come around. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He had made himself visible. He had taken a stand, and the consequences of that decision were real. But the silence, the growing chasm between him and the people he cared about, felt like something that might never heal. Maybe that was the price of standing up for what was right. The next morning, Ellie sat in front of him in history class. When she turned to speak to him, her voice was soft, hesitant. "Micah, can we talk after class?" Micah felt his heart race. He didn't know if he was ready for this. Not after everything that had happened, the growing tension, the distance. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear what she had to say. But he nodded anyway. After class, they walked to the courtyard together. The air was cool, and the sound of birds chirping seemed too peaceful for the storm Micah was feeling inside. Ellie spoke first, her voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." Micah crossed his arms, waiting for her to continue. "You're my friend, Micah," Ellie said, her eyes searching his. "I don't want to lose that. But I don't know how to navigate this anymore. It feels like things are shifting, and I don't know what my place is anymore. You know." Micah stared at her, his heart aching. "I get it, Ellie. I do. It's hard. It's just hard." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I didn't want to make it harder for you. I didn't want to make it about me. She sighed, looking away. "I don't want to hurt you. But I think I've been avoiding you. I don't know how to fix it." Micah took a deep breath. I think we both need time. To figure out what this is. What we want this to be." Ellie nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't want to lose you, Micah." "You won't," he said quietly, though the ache in his chest told him he wasn't so sure. "Not anymore." As the day went on, Micah couldn't shake the feeling of distance, a space between him and Ellie that he wasn't sure would ever be filled. But in the quiet of that afternoon, he realized something. The silence was its own kind of message. It wasn't just that people weren't speaking to him, it was that they were no longer willing to stand with him, to share the same ground. And the weight of that truth hung heavy. Micah didn't sleep much that night. His mind kept replaying the conversation with Ellie over and over again. He had walked away from it feeling unsure, his chest tight with the weight of her words. There was something in her eyes, something that told him she was torn between her friendship with him and the pressures of everything else. And the more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. The silence. The distance. Micah knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Ellie had said she didn't want to lose him, but was that enough? Was it enough to bridge the growing gap between them? Between him and everyone else? Wednesday afternoon, the tension in the air was palpable. Micah walked into the cafeteria, looking around for a place to sit. It was like a war zone, students laughing, shouting, talking in groups. But all Micah could feel was the cold, invisible line that had been drawn between him and the rest of the world. Ellie was sitting with her new friends again. So was Carlos. Micah didn't bother approaching. The rejection felt too fresh, too real. He sat at the corner table, alone, watching the world go by. But as soon as he opened his lunch, he noticed the glare. It came from across the room, from the table where Tyler and his group sat. Tyler wasn't smiling. In fact, he was staring at Micah as if he were some kind of puzzle, his eyes narrowing with growing irritation. Micah's stomach dropped. He could already feel the storm brewing. It didn't take long for the storm to break. Just as Micah finished eating, Tyler and his friends got up from their table, walking toward him with the kind of purpose that made the hair on the back of Micah's neck stand up. Hey, Jacobs, Tyler's voice called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Micah tried to ignore him, focusing on his phone. But Tyler wasn't having it. Not gonna talk to me now, huh? You're so special now, aren't you? Tyler continued, his voice laced with venom. Micah felt a knot form in his stomach. He had tried to stay out of it, to focus on the positive people in his life, but here was Tyler, once again trying to drag him into the mess. Is there a problem? Micah asked, his voice betraying none of the frustration he felt. Tyler smirked, leaning in close. Yeah, there's a problem. You're here, trying to act all high and mighty, like you've got something to prove. But you're just a joke, Jacobs. The words hit harder than Micah expected, but he wasn't going to let Tyler see it. Not today. Maybe you should mind your own business, Tyler, he said, his voice low, but steady. His heart was racing. This was not the first time he'd been pushed, but this time, something in him snapped. Tyler's eyes flared with anger. He stepped closer, his voice getting louder. You think you can just walk around here, all righteous? Acting like you're some kind of hero? You're nothing. Micah stood up from the table, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't care who was watching anymore. He was tired of being quiet. He was tired of being the one who let others push him around. You don't get to talk to me like that anymore, Micah said, his voice firm and clear, despite the growing heat in his chest. You don't get to decide who I am or what I stand for. Tyler sneered. Oh, really? Well, let's see if anyone else here agrees with you. He turned toward his group of friends, who were all watching with smirks on their faces, as if waiting for the show to start. Micah didn't care. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to be silent anymore. The confrontation escalated quickly. Tyler shoved Micah, just a little. But that was all it took. Micah's emotions bubbled to the surface, and before he knew it, he was pushing Tyler back. Don't touch me, Micah growled, his heart pounding in his chest. The crowd around them started to gather, some of the other students whispering to each other, murmuring in excitement. But Micah wasn't paying attention to them. He was focused on the person standing in front of him, the person who had been tormenting him for months. Tyler shoved him again, but this time Micah didn't take it. With everything he had, Micah pushed Tyler back harder, his voice loud now. You want to make something out of this? Fine. Let's do it. But not today. Not like this. There was a brief silence. Tyler, taken aback for the first time in their entire rivalry, narrowed his eyes at Micah. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but Micah was already walking away. He wasn't about to let Tyler drag him into a fight, not now, not like this. As Micah made his way out of the cafeteria, he could hear the buzz of whispers following him. But this time, it wasn't just Tyler's group. It was everyone. He was used to being the quiet kid, the one who stayed out of the spotlight. But something had shifted today. Something had snapped in him. For the first time in a long time, Micah had fought back. And it felt like a victory. Later that day, Micah sat alone on the steps outside the school, his hands shaking slightly. The adrenaline was still pumping through him, making him feel both lighter and more exhausted than ever before. Ellie and Carlos passed by him on their way to the parking lot, but they didn't stop. They didn't even look his way. The divide between them felt even wider now, and the silence, the distance, was so thick, it hurt to breathe. Micah didn't know what he had expected from them. A smile, a nod of understanding. A simple acknowledgement that he wasn't in this alone. But they kept walking, as if he wasn't even there. The pain that followed was almost overwhelming. That night, after everything settled, Micah stared at his phone again. He'd received a few texts, most of them from Rachel. She'd messaged him multiple times. That was brave. I'm proud of you. You didn't let them get to you. But then there were a few messages from people he didn't know. People from the school, some of them friends of Ellie and Carlos, some of them strangers. You're a joke. Thought you were better than that, Micah. Micah didn't reply to any of them. He was tired of the noise. Tired of the opinions. Tired of trying to make people see what he was standing for. But in the quiet that followed, he realized something. Fighting back wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about choosing not to shrink. Choosing to take up space. Choosing not to be silent. And for the first time in a long time, Micah felt like he had a voice. The bell rang at the end of the school day, signaling the start of another afternoon, but to Micah, it felt more like the end of something than the beginning. The crowd around him in the hallway was buzzing with energy, but it all felt muffled, like he was hearing the world through thick glass. Micah's thoughts were elsewhere, on the confrontation, on Tyler, on everything that had gone wrong. He had thought standing up to Tyler would be liberating. Instead, it felt like the weight of the world had been dropped on him, and he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to carry it. As Micah walked toward his locker, he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Carlos. Micah sighed, bracing himself for whatever came next. He wasn't sure if he was ready for a conversation with Carlos. After everything that had happened, their friendship was hanging by a thread. The silence between them had only grown more suffocating since the confrontation with Tyler. Micah, Carlos said, his voice hesitant, but his words seemed to carry the weight of something heavier. We need to talk. Micah stopped, finally turning to face him. There was something in Carlos's eyes, a mix of guilt and confusion, that Micah hadn't expected. Carlos looked like he didn't know how to approach this, like he was torn between the person he had been and the person he was becoming. I know things have been weird, Carlos continued, his voice quieter now. But I didn't want to. Don't, Micah cut him off. Don't try to explain it. I get it. I've been the odd one out this whole time, right? The quiet one. The one who never really fits in. Carlos's face softened. That's not what I meant. It's just, everything is changing so fast. You're standing up for something, and I'm not sure how to handle it. Micah shook his head. That's the problem, Carlos. You weren't sure. You and Ellie, you were both so supportive at first, but now you're both just, avoiding me. And for what? So I can keep my mouth shut and go back to being invisible. Carlos sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not like that. I don't want you to go back to being invisible. I just don't know how to handle everything that's happening. It feels like things are spiraling, and I don't know what to do with that. Micah stared at him, frustrated. But as he looked into Carlos's eyes, something shifted. He could see the fear there, the fear of losing their friendship, of everything changing in a way that neither of them could control. Look, Micah said, his voice steady but firm, I didn't do this to lose my friends. But I'm not going to stay quiet anymore. You don't have to agree with me, but at least stop pretending like nothing's wrong. I'm not invisible anymore. Carlos nodded, and for the first time in days, Micah felt like there was a flicker of understanding between them. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. Later that evening, Micah sat in his room, staring at his phone. He had received a barrage of texts, mostly from people who weren't his friends, but there were a few from Rachel. One of them caught his eye. I saw what happened in the cafeteria. You were amazing. I've been wanting to say something, but I was too scared. You gave me courage. Micah felt a warmth spread through him as he read the message. Maybe Rachel wasn't the only one who had been scared. Maybe he had given someone else the courage to stand up, too. Just as he was about to reply, another message came through from Ellie. It was short, just one sentence. Can we talk? Micah stared at the words for a long time, his fingers hovering over the screen. There was a part of him that didn't want to respond. He didn't know if he could handle another conversation with Ellie, not after the way things had been between them lately. But something in him told him he couldn't walk away without hearing what she had to say. He texted back. Yeah. Where? The next day, during lunch, Micah found Ellie waiting for him outside the cafeteria. She looked almost nervous, like she wasn't sure what to say or how to say it. Micah approached her, his heart pounding, unsure of what to expect. Hey, Ellie said quietly, offering a small smile. I owe you an apology. Micah didn't know how to respond to that. An apology? From Ellie? It was almost too surreal. He had been waiting for something like this, something to fix the growing divide between them, but now that it was here, he didn't know how to take it. For what? He asked, his voice neutral, though inside, he was struggling to keep his emotions in check. I've been avoiding you, Ellie said, her voice full of regret. I didn't know how to deal with everything that happened. It felt like things were changing too fast, and I didn't know how to keep up. I didn't want to lose you, but I didn't know how to support you either. Micah's heart softened a little at her words. There was sincerity in her voice, something raw and unguarded that he hadn't heard from her in weeks. I don't know if I can fix it, she continued. But I want to try. I don't want to lose you either. Micah nodded slowly, feeling a weight lift off his chest. I don't want to lose you either, Ellie. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to be quiet anymore. I can't be that person anymore. And if you can't be okay with that, then I don't know where we go from here. Ellie bit her lip, her eyes filled with emotion. I can be okay with it. I want to be okay with it. I need time to figure it out. But I'm not going anywhere. I promise. As the day passed, Micah felt like he was slowly starting to piece together the fractured parts of his life. The conversations with Carlos and Ellie were not easy, but they were honest. And in a way, they gave him hope. Later that night, Micah sat at his desk, staring at the messages on his phone. He was exhausted, physically, emotionally, but there was a sense of peace settling over him. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a while, it felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't fighting it alone. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The halls of the school felt different to Micah the next morning. It wasn't just the lingering whispers or the way people seemed to watch him as he passed. There was something new in the air, something that made him feel like he wasn't as invisible as he had been just a few weeks ago. Maybe it was because he had stood up to Tyler. Maybe it was because he'd finally started pushing back, refusing to be the silent one in the background. Or maybe it was because, for once, someone had seen him for who he was. That someone was Rachel. Micah didn't expect her to be waiting for him by his locker before first period, but there she was, standing against the lockers with a nervous smile. Hey, she said, her voice soft but clear. I know you probably didn't expect me to be here, but I wanted to talk. Micah raised an eyebrow, surprised. Rachel had always been a little on the outside, quiet, like him, but they hadn't spoken much before the cafeteria incident. Now, though, there was a connection. She had seen him stand up to Tyler, and she had been watching from the sidelines, too. Sure, Micah replied, giving her a tentative smile. What's up? Rachel's eyes darted around as if checking if anyone was watching, then she leaned in slightly, her voice lower. I saw what happened yesterday. With Tyler. And, honestly, it was amazing. I don't think I could have done that. I don't even know how you did it. Micah chuckled softly. I wasn't sure I could do it either. It felt like everything was just building up, and I had to let it out. Rachel nodded, her expression serious. Yeah, I get that. I've been watching for a while, and I've always been so scared to stand up to people like Tyler, you know. But seeing you yesterday, it gave me courage. I guess I just wanted to say thank you for that. Micah was taken aback. He had never thought of his actions as inspiring someone else. To him, it had been more of a release, a necessary act of defiance. But Rachel's words made him realize something important: standing up to Tyler had done more than just give him a moment of catharsis. It had rippled outward, touching others in ways he hadn't expected. "You don't have to thank me," Micah said, his voice softer now. "I was just trying to stand up for myself. But, if it helped you, then that's good to know." Rachel smiled, but her eyes were filled with something deeper, an unspoken understanding, perhaps. "I think it's more than just standing up for yourself, Micah. It's standing up for all of us. For the people who can't or won't." Micah's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't thought of it like that, but it made sense. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger. The bell rang, signaling the start of class, and Rachel waved as she walked away, her face still carrying that thoughtful expression. Micah couldn't help but feel a little lighter. He had expected the aftermath of his confrontation with Tyler to be filled with more tension, more isolation. But Rachel's words, her quiet support, made him realize that maybe things weren't so bleak after all. Later that day, during history class, Micah found himself glancing at Rachel again, who was sitting across the room. There was a subtle change in the way she looked at him, less like a distant observer and more like someone who had shared a moment of understanding with him. The class was discussing the civil rights movement, and the teacher, Mrs. Williams, had asked the students to reflect on what it meant to stand up for something they believed in. "Micah," Mrs. Williams said, suddenly calling on him. "What about you? What's your take on standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult?" The class turned to look at him, some faces curious, others indifferent. It wasn't the first time Micah had been put on the spot like this, but this time, it felt different. This time, he didn't hesitate. "I think standing up for what's right is important," he said, his voice steady. "Even when it's hard. Even when you're the only one doing it. You can't be afraid to speak your truth. Otherwise, you're just letting the world tell you who you are." There was a silence after he spoke. Mrs. Williams looked impressed, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were contemplating his words. "Well said, Micah," she responded. "It takes a lot of courage to speak up, especially when the world seems to want you to be quiet." Micah sat back in his seat, feeling the weight of her words settle into him. It was one thing to stand up for yourself, but it was another thing entirely to speak up in front of others. To let people see you. And in that moment, Micah realized something else: he wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for all the people who had been silenced. The ones who were too afraid to speak, who had been shoved into corners and told to stay quiet. That was what he was fighting for now. After class, Rachel caught up with him in the hallway. "You were awesome in there," she said, her face lighting up with genuine admiration. Micah smiled, grateful for the support. "Thanks. I think it just hit me, you know. That I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it for everyone who's been pushed down, told to keep quiet." Rachel nodded. "I get that. And I want to help." Micah stopped in his tracks, surprised by her words. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if we're going to change anything, we can't do it alone," she said, her voice serious now. "I want to be part of this. I want to stand up, too. With you." For the first time in a long while, Micah felt the spark of something real. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was their fight. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Micah, Rachel, and even Carlos started to organize small discussions after school, talking about the issues that mattered to them. At first, it was just a handful of students, mostly people who had been quietly watching the growing tension between Micah and Tyler's group. But as the days went on, more and more students began to show up. It was slow. It was messy. But it was happening. And for the first time, Micah didn't feel alone. Rachel was there, helping to guide the conversations, keeping them on track. Carlos, too, though he still hesitated at times, was more present than ever. And even Ellie had started coming around again, though it was clear she was still trying to find her way. That afternoon, as Micah walked out of the school building, he saw Tyler and his friends by their usual spot, laughing and joking among themselves. But this time, something was different. Micah didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply walked past them, his head held high, knowing that he was no longer alone. It started small, an after-school meeting here and there, a few friends gathering in the library, exchanging ideas about how to make their voices heard. But as the weeks passed, Micah could feel the shift. More students began showing up, sitting in the back of the room, quietly nodding as they listened to the discussions. At first, it was a mix of people, some with no real intention of getting involved, just curious about the movement that had started to grow around Micah. Others, like Rachel, Carlos, and Ellie, were there because they believed in the cause. They had seen something that Micah had ignited, something they wanted to be part of. But soon, it became clear, this wasn't just about Micah anymore. It was about all of them. It was a Wednesday afternoon when it happened. Micah was walking down the hallway, heading toward the library for their weekly meeting, when he was stopped by one of the seniors, Jasmine, who had been attending the discussions for the past few days. "Micah," she called out as she jogged toward him, her expression eager. "Hey, Jasmine," Micah said, pausing. "What's up?" "I've been talking to some of the students in my history class," she said, her voice low but excited. "And I think we've got something here. People are starting to talk. This could really turn into something big." Micah blinked, taken aback by her words. He hadn't expected the group to spread so quickly, let alone to attract the attention of upperclassmen. "Wait, what do you mean?" "I mean, there's a movement here," Jasmine continued. "A real one. People are talking about it, and not just in the library. I think it's time to make it official, maybe even get the whole school involved." Micah felt his stomach flip. The idea of going public with their cause was exciting but terrifying. He had always kept his head down, avoided too much attention. But now, things were changing. He looked at Jasmine. "You're serious?" "Absolutely," she said, her eyes flashing with determination. "We can't just talk about this anymore. We need to take action." The next day, Jasmine's prediction began to unfold. Word had spread. The library, once a quiet and almost deserted place after school, was now filled with students. Some were there to discuss, others just to listen, but the energy in the room was palpable. For the first time in his life, Micah wasn't the only one speaking up. There were dozens of voices, some timid, others full of passion. Micah stood at the front of the room, looking at the sea of faces that had gathered. Rachel stood beside him, Carlos near the back, keeping to himself but clearly engaged. Ellie was at the table near the front, her eyes scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "I think it's time we start organizing," Micah said, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've got a lot of people here, and I know there are more who want to be part of this. But we need to be strategic. We need to make sure that what we're doing actually makes a difference." The group murmured in agreement, a wave of excitement rippling through the room. "But how do we do that?" Rachel asked, raising her hand. "We've been talking for weeks, but now it's time to take action. We need a plan." Micah nodded. "Exactly. We can start by reaching out to other students, getting them involved. We need to make this bigger than just us. I think we need to start with something visual, something everyone can see and be a part of." "What about a protest?" Jasmine suggested, her voice filled with confidence. "A school-wide protest. Something symbolic." There was a pause as the group considered the idea. Micah's heart raced. A protest? That was a huge step. It could get them the attention they needed, but it could also backfire. There were too many risks to consider. But he couldn't deny it, it was exactly what they needed. We'll need to plan this carefully, Micah said, pacing in front of the group. We don't want this to turn into chaos. We need to have a clear message and a clear purpose. We're not doing this just for the sake of being heard. We're doing this because we believe in something. What's the message going to be? Carlos asked, breaking his silence. His voice was quieter than usual, but there was a seriousness to it that Micah appreciated. Micah stopped pacing and turned to face him. Equality. Unity. The right to speak your truth without fear. There was a collective nod in the room. Everyone knew what that meant. The next few days were a blur of planning. Micah, Rachel, Carlos, and Jasmine became the core of the movement, organizing meetings, designing posters, and reaching out to anyone they thought could help. They had a mission now. It was more than just a group of students talking about what was wrong. It was a movement with a clear purpose, a message that resonated with anyone who had ever felt voiceless. They decided that the protest would take place during the next school assembly, a public, high-visibility event that would ensure they had an audience. The idea was simple: when the assembly started, the students would stand up and hold up signs with messages of equality and justice, signaling to the entire school that they were no longer going to stay quiet. They would stand together, literally and figuratively. But as the day of the protest approached, Micah felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The pressure was building. What if it failed? What if no one showed up? He tried not to think about it too much, but it was hard to ignore the nagging doubts. The stakes were higher now, and failure was no longer an option. There were too many people who had come forward to support him, to support all of them. The morning of the protest arrived, and Micah stood outside the school building, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. He looked over at Rachel, who was standing beside him, her eyes wide with anticipation. "This is it," she said, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Yeah," Micah said, his voice tight. "We can't back down now." "Don't worry," Rachel said, her hand brushing his lightly. "You've got this. We've all got this." Micah swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. There was no turning back now. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the assembly, the students filed into the gymnasium. Micah, Rachel, Carlos, and Jasmine were at the front, holding their signs. Their hearts raced as they stood in their spots, waiting for the moment when they would make their move. And then it happened. The principal stood up on the stage, beginning his speech, when suddenly, the first student stood up. Then another. And another. Soon, the entire group was standing, holding their signs high for the whole school to see. The gymnasium fell silent as the students made their stand. This wasn't just a protest. This was a declaration. Micah could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but for the first time in his life, it wasn't fear he felt. It was something else. Something powerful. They weren't just standing up for themselves anymore. They were standing for everyone who had ever been silenced. The morning after the protest was a whirlwind. Micah had barely slept, his mind spinning with everything that had happened the day before. What had started as a quiet movement between a few like-minded students had exploded into something much bigger. The protest had gone off without a hitch, but the aftermath wasn't as clear-cut. There was no turning back now. Micah sat in his first period English class, his eyes fixed on the clock. The seconds seemed to tick by in slow motion, each one bringing him closer to the inevitable confrontation he knew was coming. He had barely processed the event when he woke up this morning, but already, it had spread beyond the school. News outlets had caught wind of the protest, and a reporter had been waiting outside the school gates as students filed in, their faces still flushed with the excitement of what they had done. "Did you hear?" Carlos whispered across the aisle, his face pale. "The local news is covering it. There's a reporter out front right now." Micah sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I knew this would happen," he muttered, more to himself than to Carlos. "Yeah, but we didn't think it would happen this fast," Carlos replied. "I mean, I'm glad people are talking about it, but, what if we've done something wrong? Micah couldn't help but feel the weight of that question. What if they had pushed too far? What if the spotlight they had asked for was too bright to bear? The bell rang, signaling the start of the next class. As students filed into the room, whispers started to ripple through the air. Micah could feel the tension. People were talking about him, about the protest. Some were excited, others skeptical. But it was clear that the conversation had shifted. When he walked into the classroom, Mrs. Williams, their history teacher, gave him a long, evaluating look from across the room. There was something unreadable in her gaze, maybe respect, maybe concern, or maybe a mixture of both. She hadn't commented on the protest yet, but Micah knew that would change soon enough. She waited until everyone was seated before speaking. "I want to address what happened yesterday," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I understand that some of you participated in the protest, and I think it's important to have an open discussion about it." The room went quiet. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "I'll be honest," Mrs. Williams continued. "I've been teaching for a long time, and I've seen my fair share of activism in school settings. Protests, movements, demonstrations, they're all part of the larger conversation. But with that kind of action comes responsibility." Micah shifted in his seat, unsure where this was going. He had expected a more positive reaction, something like a pat on the back. Instead, Mrs. Williams was taking a more measured approach. "We need to talk about the consequences of your actions," she said, locking eyes with Micah. "Because protesting is only the beginning. Now, you have to think about what comes next. What do you want to accomplish with this?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Micah opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He hadn't thought that far ahead. The protest had been a way to express their anger, their frustration. But now, with the spotlight on them, what did they really want to achieve? Later that afternoon, Micah was called to the principal's office. He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Walking down the hallway toward Principal Thompson's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change forever. The door to the office swung open as Micah stepped inside. Principal Thompson, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a perpetually stern expression, was sitting behind his desk. His glasses gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his eyes narrowed as he looked up at Micah. "Micah," he said, his voice neutral but carrying a weight that Micah couldn't ignore. "Sit down." Micah did as he was told, pulling out a chair and sitting across from the principal. His heart was racing, his palms sweaty. "I'm sure you know why you're here," Principal Thompson said. "We've received numerous complaints about the protest yesterday. I've had conversations with some of the staff, and we've even heard from some parents." Micah nodded, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. "First of all," Principal Thompson continued, "I want to make it clear that your right to free speech is important. We live in a country where you have the freedom to express your opinions, even in a public school. But that right comes with a responsibility." Micah kept his eyes on the principal, trying not to show the nervousness creeping up his throat. "I've been told that the protest disrupted the school day," Principal Thompson said. "It caused some students to feel uncomfortable, even threatened. And while I understand the intent behind it, we need to make sure that this doesn't escalate into something harmful." Micah felt a pang in his chest. He had known the protest wouldn't be received by everyone the way he had hoped, but hearing the principal's words made the reality of it all hit him hard. The protest was meant to be a call for unity, not division. But now, it seemed like the very thing they had hoped would bring people together was beginning to tear them apart. "I'm not going to suspend you, Micah," Principal Thompson said, breaking into Micah's thoughts. "But I am asking you to reflect on your actions. What do you want this movement to be? How do you plan to keep it from dividing the school even further?" Micah opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had no idea how to answer that. He didn't have a clear plan. All he had were feelings, anger, frustration, a desire to be heard. But he hadn't considered the consequences of those feelings before he acted. Think about it, Principal Thompson said, his voice softer now. The road ahead is going to be much harder than you think. But if you want this to be something lasting, something meaningful, you need to be strategic. And you need to be prepared for the pushback. After the conversation with Principal Thompson, Micah walked out of the office with a heavy heart. He had expected to be told to sit in detention or face punishment, but the principal's words felt like a warning. He wasn't being punished, he was being challenged. The rest of the day dragged on. As Micah walked to his next class, he could feel eyes on him from every direction. Some were admiring, others critical. He didn't know if it was just his imagination, but it felt like the entire school had split into two camps, those who supported him and those who wanted him to fail. At lunch, Rachel sat beside him in the cafeteria, her face tight with concern. "How'd it go with the principal?" she asked softly, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of what had happened. Micah shrugged. "He didn't suspend me, but he wants me to think about what happens next. He's worried about how this is affecting the school. And honestly, I don't know if he's wrong." Rachel was quiet for a moment, then she placed a hand on his arm. "I get it. We all do. But this isn't going away. We can't just stop now." Micah nodded, trying to find the strength to push forward. "Yeah. I guess the real work starts now." The days following the protest felt like a blur of messages, meetings, and mounting pressure. Micah had always known that starting a movement would bring its share of challenges, but he hadn't anticipated just how overwhelming it would be. It was no longer just about a few students in the library. It had grown beyond that. Now, they were on the radar of everyone, teachers, administrators, even parents. The first real blow came a week after the protest. Micah was walking to his locker between classes when he saw Principal Thompson standing in the hallway, speaking with a teacher Micah didn't recognize. The conversation looked serious, and as Micah approached, the principal's eyes flicked to him. The teacher gave him a tight-lipped smile, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. Micah's stomach churned. He had a sinking feeling that something was about to happen. As he passed, Principal Thompson called him over. "Micah, can we have a quick chat?" Micah's heart thudded in his chest, but he nodded and approached the principal's office, his mind racing. "Is something wrong, sir?" The principal motioned for him to sit down. "I want to talk about the movement. Specifically, how we're going to handle things moving forward. It's been brought to my attention that several of your classmates, particularly from the sports teams, are feeling uncomfortable with the protest." Micah frowned. "Uncomfortable? What do you mean?" "Well, there's been some backlash," the principal said, his voice calm but firm. "Some students are feeling alienated. There are even rumors circulating that it's turning into a disruption during school hours. I've had a few calls from concerned parents as well." Micah opened his mouth to speak but stopped himself. What was he supposed to say? He'd expected resistance from some corners of the school, but this? This felt like something much bigger. It felt personal. "I'm not saying you're in the wrong," Principal Thompson said. "But you need to understand the bigger picture here. You're starting to divide the school, and that's something we can't afford. We need to find a way to address the concerns of all the students, not just the ones who are on your side." Micah nodded slowly, trying to digest everything the principal was saying. "I didn't mean for it to divide anyone," he said quietly. "I just wanted people to be heard." "I know," Principal Thompson said. "But we need to approach this with care. This could escalate, and if it does, it'll be harder to manage." Micah felt the weight of those words. Escalation wasn't something he'd considered, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how far-reaching this had become. He couldn't back down now, but the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. As if the conversation with the principal wasn't enough, the next challenge came from the football team. The following Monday, Micah was approached by Tyler, the team captain. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it wasn't going to be a friendly chat. "Micah," Tyler said, his voice low, "We need to talk." Micah met his gaze, trying to read his expression. "What's up?" Tyler leaned in, his arms crossed over his chest. "Look, I get it. You want change. You want to be heard. But this protest, this whole movement, it's messing with the team. The guys are pissed off, and you're making things uncomfortable for everyone." Micah's heart sank. "I'm not trying to mess with anyone," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just trying to make sure people who've been ignored finally have a chance to speak up." Tyler shook his head. "That's not how this works. You can't just walk in here and stir up trouble. Some of the guys think this protest was disrespectful, especially with what's been happening in the media. You've put us all in the spotlight, and now we've got to deal with the fallout." Micah's hands clenched into fists. "I didn't ask for the spotlight. I didn't want this to be about making people uncomfortable. But it's the truth, Tyler. People are angry. They've been silenced for too long." Tyler stared at him for a moment, his face hardening. "I don't know. But you'd better figure it out fast. Because if things keep going like this, it won't just be the school against you. You'll have more enemies than you can handle." Micah wanted to respond, but the words didn't come. Tyler had made his point clear. This was no longer just a fight for justice, it was a fight for survival. The next few days felt like a roller coaster of emotions. Micah had been receiving messages from his friends, his classmates, and even people he didn't know. Some were supportive, encouraging him to keep going, while others were filled with anger and resentment. The line between ally and adversary was growing thinner, and Micah couldn't escape the pressure building on all sides. To make matters worse, he couldn't help but notice the growing division in his own group. Rachel, who had always been his biggest supporter, was beginning to pull away. One afternoon, Micah found her in the library, her books spread out in front of her, but her mind clearly elsewhere. "Rachel," Micah said, sitting down across from her. "What's going on?" She looked up, her eyes tired, almost defeated. "I don't know, Micah. I don't think this is what I signed up for. I mean, I thought we were doing this for a good cause. But now it feels like everyone's turning against us. Like it's not even about the movement anymore. It's just about the fight." Micah opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. She wasn't wrong. The movement had shifted. It had gone from a call for unity to a battleground where everyone had something to prove. The purity of their initial cause had become clouded by the pressure to win over support, and, worse, to survive the fallout. "I get it," Micah said, his voice soft. "But we can't stop now. We've come too far." "I'm not saying we should stop," Rachel replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But we have to figure out what we're really fighting for. What happens when the people we're trying to help turn their backs on us too?" Micah had no answer. He only knew one thing: he couldn't quit. Not now. But he also had to admit, the challenges were just beginning. The school year felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Each day brought a new challenge, a new problem. The weight of leadership was heavier than he had ever imagined. And with every new obstacle, he was forced to confront a harsh truth: not everyone was going to support them. The pressure of the movement was starting to feel suffocating. Each day brought a new challenge, a new reason to question whether any of this was worth it. The protests had grown more intense, the media coverage more invasive, and the resistance had reached a boiling point. Micah had always believed in the power of change, but now, with everything spinning out of control, he wasn't so sure anymore. It was a Friday afternoon when things finally cracked. Micah sat in the library, surrounded by his closest friends. Rachel, Carlos, and a few others had gathered to discuss the next steps. They had been planning another demonstration for the following week, but the atmosphere was tense. Everyone was on edge, their nerves fraying with each passing day. "I'm not sure we can keep doing this," Rachel said, her voice quiet but firm. "I mean, the backlash is getting worse. The school is coming down hard on us. The parents are angry, the football team's turned against us, and now even some of the teachers are starting to question us. Micah glanced at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. She wasn't wrong. The movement that had once felt like a breath of fresh air was now starting to feel like a suffocating cloud. I know, Micah replied, his voice hoarse. But we can't stop. We started this for a reason. We're not just fighting for us, we're fighting for everyone who feels like they've been overlooked. Carlos, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. It's not just about the fight anymore, Micah. It's about survival. We're all getting dragged into something we can't control. The media is all over this now. The whole town knows our names. Rachel shook her head, frustration clear in her eyes. You're acting like this is a game, Micah. It's not. It's dangerous. We're all at risk of losing something, our reputations, our friendships, maybe even our futures. Micah stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm not going to just give up. This is bigger than all of us. If we stop now, everything we've done means nothing. Rachel stood too, her face flushed with anger. And if we keep going, what do we have left? We'll be torn apart. I can't keep fighting for something that's already falling apart. The word stung. Micah had always known that leadership came with its sacrifices, but he hadn't expected this level of personal cost. His friends were starting to turn on him, and the weight of it felt unbearable. Later that afternoon, the breaking point came when Micah found himself alone in the parking lot, his back against the brick wall of the school building. He was trying to gather his thoughts when he saw Tyler, the football team captain, approaching him with a few of his teammates in tow. Micah's stomach churned. He had known this conversation was inevitable, but now that it was happening, he felt a sense of dread creeping in. Tyler stopped a few feet away, his expression cold. Micah, he said, his voice flat, we need to talk. Micah crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. About what? You're pushing everyone too far, Tyler said, his tone sharp. I don't know what you're trying to prove, but you've turned the whole school against you. You're making things worse. We're getting pressure from our families, from the coaches, and now even the community's talking about us. You're forcing everyone to pick sides. Micah could feel his blood boiling. You think I wanted this? He shot back. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted people to stop ignoring the problem. Tyler stepped closer, his jaw clenched. And you think this is the way to fix it? By causing division? By making us all look like the enemy? Micah's heart raced. I never wanted to divide anyone. I just wanted people to listen. You know what it feels like to be overlooked, Tyler. You know what it feels like to be stuck in a place where you have no voice. Tyler's eyes flickered for a moment, and for a split second, Micah saw something that resembled guilt. But then the mask returned. I'm not here to argue with you, Tyler said, his voice low. I'm here to tell you that if this keeps going, it's going to get a lot worse for you. And for everyone who's standing with you. I don't want to see anyone get hurt because of this. Micah stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't sure if Tyler was threatening him, trying to scare him into backing down, or if he was genuinely concerned. But Micah didn't have time to figure it out. I'm not backing down, Micah said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. I can't. Not when so many people need to be heard. Tyler didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, his teammates following behind him. As they disappeared into the distance, Micah felt a cold chill wash over him. This wasn't just about making change anymore. This was about survival. The tension continued to rise over the weekend. Micah and his friends spent hours planning their next steps, but the group was beginning to fragment. Rachel was starting to pull away, her doubts about the movement growing stronger. Carlos was unsure of what to do, caught between his loyalty to his friends and the pressure to stay out of the spotlight. Micah tried to hold it all together, but he felt the strain. He couldn't lead when the people around him were falling apart. The very foundation of the movement felt shaky, and every day it seemed like more people were starting to question whether they could keep going. By Sunday night, Micah was at his breaking point. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. His mind raced with questions he didn't have answers to. Was this worth it? Was it worth losing his friends, his peace, and his sense of self? He didn't know anymore. As the new week began, Micah found himself standing at the crossroads he had been avoiding for so long. The next step wasn't clear. The resistance had grown stronger, and the fight had become personal. More than ever, Micah needed to decide whether he was truly ready to fight for what he believed in, no matter the cost. The sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand felt deafening. Micah stared at the screen, watching the notifications pile up one after the other. News stories, text messages, social media updates, everything was flashing across his screen. The world outside his bedroom felt like it was closing in on him. And yet, in the midst of all the chaos, one thing was clear: he had to make a choice. The movement had spiraled. What had once been a unified cry for justice had now splintered into factions. Rachel was pulling further away, her doubts weighing heavily on her. Carlos was caught in the middle, unsure of where his loyalties should lie. Even his closest allies were growing weary, questioning the cost of everything they'd fought for. Micah knew he couldn't keep living in uncertainty. He had to decide whether he was willing to fight for this cause, no matter the personal toll, or whether he should walk away before everything unraveled. It wasn't until the next morning that Micah made up his mind. He grabbed his jacket and walked out the door, the crisp morning air biting at his face. He was determined to reach out to the people who still believed in the cause, the ones who hadn't given up yet. He made his way to the library, the familiar path now feeling like a journey he was taking alone. As he pushed open the door, he was met with the usual murmurs and whispers. But this time, it wasn't the same. Rachel wasn't there, and neither was Carlos. Most of the regulars who had shown up to their meetings had scattered, leaving only a handful of students still present. Micah sat down at the table, his heart pounding. It felt like everything was falling apart. Then, as if by instinct, Sam, a student who had been quiet through much of the movement's early stages, stood up. "Micah, we need to talk." Micah's throat tightened. "I'm listening." "I'm with you," Sam said, their voice steady. "But we need to make a decision here. Either we take this to the next level or we let it all fall apart." Micah exhaled deeply. Sam's words were a gut punch. He could feel the weight of every decision hanging over him. "I know," Micah said quietly, looking around the room. "I know I've been pushing this too hard. But I can't back down now. Not after everything. We've come too far." "I get that," Sam replied. "But you're not alone in this. We all need to step up, Micah. We need to be all in. If you're serious about this, you need to show the others you're committed, no matter what it costs." For the first time in weeks, Micah felt a spark of hope. Sam had been right. This wasn't just about his fight anymore, it was about everyone who had stood with him. He couldn't lead if his group was fragmented. They had to unite, or they would lose everything. The decision was made. Micah was going all in. No more hesitation, no more doubts. The movement needed something bigger. It needed one final push, one last stand to prove that they weren't just going to fade into the background like so many other movements before them. Later that afternoon, Micah sent out a text message to everyone who had been involved: Rachel, Carlos, even the ones who had stopped showing up. It was time for them to come together. He didn't know if they would be able to set aside their differences, but he had to try. The message was simple but direct. This is our last chance. We either step up and do this together, or we walk away. But I'm all in. Who's with me? It felt like a declaration, a challenge. And for the first time in a long time, Micah felt the weight of leadership lifting slightly from his shoulders. He was ready to lead them through this, even if it meant risking everything. The responses trickled in, one by one. Some were short and uncertain. Others were filled with hesitation. But the more Micah read, the more he realized that this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs, too. Carlos responded first. "I'm in. Let's do this." Then Rachel, after a long pause. "I don't know if this is the right choice, Micah. But I can't sit on the sidelines anymore. I'll help. I'm with you." Micah felt a weight lift off his chest. The group was coming back together, piece by piece. The fractures that had been forming over the past few weeks were beginning to heal. The following Monday was the day of their final push. Micah had gathered everyone in the gym, a place where they could plan and strategize without the prying eyes of the administration. The group was small, but there was a quiet strength among them. These were the ones who hadn't given up. These were the ones who believed. "We have one shot at this," Micah said as the group sat in a circle. "We can't afford to be half-hearted. This is everything we've been fighting for. I know it's been hard. I know it's felt like we're losing. But this is the turning point. If we want to make a real difference, we need to show up. And we need to show up strong." Rachel, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke. "Micah's right. We can't keep second-guessing ourselves. This is our time to make a statement. We need to hit them where it counts." Carlos nodded. "The whole school's been watching us. We can't just go through the motions. We've got to bring it home." Micah felt the energy shift in the room. There was no more doubt. There was only resolve. That afternoon, the group gathered outside the school, holding signs and chanting their message. The student body had started to trickle outside, curious to see what was going on. This wasn't just another protest. This was their final stand. Micah stood in front of the crowd, his heart racing. The media was there, cameras flashing, reporters scribbling notes. This was their moment to make a lasting impact. "This isn't just about us anymore," Micah shouted over the chants. "This is about every person who has ever been silenced. This is about every voice that has been ignored. Today, we're going to make sure the world knows we won't be quiet any longer." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy feeding Micah's determination. He could feel it, the movement wasn't dead. It was alive, and it was ready to change everything. Micah had made the decision. He had gone all in. And now, with the support of his friends and the power of their voices, they would take the fight all the way. The real test had just begun. The day after the protest was chaotic, to say the least. The air felt thick with tension as students crowded the hallways, whispering about the demonstration. Some were supportive, others were critical, but everyone had an opinion. For the first time since the movement began, Micah felt a flicker of hope. The noise was growing, the voices that had once been silenced were now demanding to be heard. But that hope was short-lived. By lunchtime, the backlash was impossible to ignore. Teachers had been told to discipline students who participated in the protest, and administrators had scheduled meetings with the key players in the movement. Micah knew he was on the chopping block. The school was ready to make an example out of him. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Rachel said, her voice tight with worry as she sat across from Micah in the cafeteria. "They're coming after us. You saw the email from the principal, right? They're threatening to suspend anyone who was involved." Micah clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had known this would come. He had known that the school would retaliate once they realized how serious this was getting. But hearing it so bluntly, seeing the fear in Rachel's eyes, made it all feel real. He didn't want to lose everything they'd worked for, not now. Not when they were so close to something bigger. "Maybe it's time to step back," Rachel suggested quietly. "Maybe we should take a break. Lay low for a while and let the heat die down." Micah looked at her, his heart sinking. He could see the doubt in her eyes, the exhaustion. He understood why she was saying it. They were all tired. But he couldn't back down now. Not after everything. He couldn't let the fear of consequences stop them from finishing what they started. No, Micah said firmly. We can't stop. Not now. We've come too far. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxious conversations, hurried notes, and quiet planning. By the time the last bell rang, Micah was drained. His phone buzzed relentlessly with text messages from Carlos, Sam, and a few others, each one echoing the same sentiment: the pressure was mounting. But there was one message that stood out. Micah, meet me outside by the gym after school. I think we can help. It was from Tyler. The same Tyler who had warned him days ago that the football team, the student body, and the administration were against him. The same Tyler who had stood on the other side of the protest, someone Micah never thought would reach out. For a moment, Micah stared at the message, unsure of what to make of it. He had to be careful. After all, Tyler was a leader in the school's social hierarchy, the captain of the football team, and a key figure in the opposition. Why would he want to help now? Was this a trick? But the more Micah thought about it, the more he realized this could be the opportunity they needed. If Tyler really was willing to help, it could mean shifting the balance. If the football team, with all their influence, could be brought into the fold, it might be enough to turn the tide in their favor. Micah made his way to the gym after school, his mind spinning with questions. The air felt different this time, charged, heavy with the weight of the unknown. As he walked around the corner, he spotted Tyler leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, watching Micah approach. Hey, Micah said, his voice cautious. Tyler looked at him, his face unreadable. For a long moment, there was silence between them, the sound of distant chatter and footsteps filling the air. Then Tyler spoke, his voice low. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Tyler began. About how we can't just ignore everything that's happening around us. I don't agree with everything you're doing, but I get it now. I see where you're coming from. Micah's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected an apology, but this was more than he had hoped for. Still, he couldn't let himself get too excited. He had to be sure Tyler was serious. What are you saying? Micah asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Tyler shifted uncomfortably before looking directly at Micah. I'm saying I want to help. Not just me, but the team. We want to support the movement. We want to make sure the school knows that we're not just going to sit on the sidelines while everything goes to hell. Micah blinked, stunned. This was the last thing he had expected. Tyler, a captain of the team, a figure of authority in the school, was offering his support. Micah could barely process it. He had expected pushback, resistance, even more threats. But this? This was a game changer. Are you serious? Micah asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and hope. Tyler nodded. Yeah. We can't stay silent anymore. This whole situation is bigger than sports, bigger than the social groups in this school. It's about what's right. And I'm tired of watching people get crushed under the weight of things they can't control. Micah stood there, struggling to find words. Tyler's words had an unexpected impact on him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like they might actually win this. But he had to be careful. He couldn't let his guard down completely. Why now? Micah asked. What changed? Tyler looked away for a moment, almost as if he were searching for the right words. Finally, he met Micah's gaze again. I've been thinking about the way I've treated people who don't fit into the right boxes. The ones who are always on the outside. I can't keep being a part of that. And I'm not the only one. The team feels the same way. Micah nodded, his mind racing. This wasn't just about one person changing their mind, it was a shift in the entire team's attitude. If Tyler could bring them on board, this could be the turning point they needed. That evening, the group reconvened. Micah relayed the news to Carlos, Rachel, and the others, his voice filled with renewed energy. It was like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt like they had a real chance. Tyler's unexpected support was the key they had been waiting for. It meant they could push back against the administration, the resistance from the students, and anyone who tried to silence them. The football team had the power to change the dynamics of the school. And now, they were on their side. As the night went on, Micah realized something important. This wasn't just about fighting the system anymore. It was about bringing people together, finding allies where he least expected them and turning those alliances into something bigger than any of them had imagined. With Tyler's help, they had just entered a new phase of the movement. And for the first time in a long time, Micah felt a renewed sense of hope. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The tension in the air was palpable. It felt like the calm before the storm, and Micah could feel it in every nerve of his body. The movement had built up to this moment, the culmination of everything they had fought for, the moment when the world would either listen or silence them once and for all. Micah stood at the front of the gymnasium, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. The place was packed. Students sat in rows, some nervously shifting in their seats, others eager for what was about to unfold. His friends were scattered throughout the crowd, their eyes locked on him. Carlos, Rachel, and even Tyler stood near the back, the football team beside him. It was strange, seeing them all together like this. What had started as a small group of rebels had now grown into a full-fledged movement. Micah wasn't sure what he had expected when he sent out that last message, asking for people to come together. But what he saw in front of him was more than just a group of students, it was an army. They had come from different backgrounds, different cliques, and different parts of the school. But now, they were all united for one cause. This is it, Micah thought to himself. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. His heart raced. His palms were clammy. But there was no turning back now. The meeting had been called by the administration, a final chance for both sides to come together and discuss the outcome of the protests. But Micah knew this wasn't just a discussion. This was their moment to make the school listen, to force the administration to acknowledge what was happening under their noses. Principal Harrison stood at the back of the gym, his arms folded across his chest. He had that look on his face, the one that said he was prepared to shut everything down, no matter what it took. Beside him stood Ms. Warner, the assistant principal who had been one of the most vocal opponents of the movement. Micah felt his throat tighten as he locked eyes with them. He knew what they thought of him, what they thought of this entire movement. They had dismissed him as a troublemaker, a kid who didn't know his place. But now, they would have to listen. The doors to the gym swung open, and the crowd went silent. The administration had arrived, along with a few faculty members who had been asked to sit in on the meeting. Micah took his place at the front of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. Principal Harrison stepped forward, his voice cold and authoritative. "Let's get this over with," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "We're here to discuss the disruptions caused by the recent protests. It's time for you students to face the consequences of your actions." Micah could feel the anger rising in him, but he held it back. He knew this was the moment. This was the time to make his voice heard, to show them that they couldn't just silence him anymore. "We're not here to be punished," Micah said, his voice firm, cutting through the silence. "We're here to make you see what you've been ignoring. The problems you've swept under the rug for too long. The ones you've told us to ignore. We've had enough." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Principal Harrison's gaze narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. Micah could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of everyone in the room on him. "Students like me have been pushed to the margins of this school for too long," Micah continued. "We've been told our voices don't matter, our struggles don't count. Well, we're here to tell you that we matter. And we're not going anywhere." Rachel stood up beside him, her voice strong. This isn't just about one person. This is about all of us. All the students who have been ignored and sidelined. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for fairness, for equality. Tyler stepped forward next, his presence commanding. The football team stood behind him, their broad shoulders and unwavering stances a testament to their commitment. "We've been part of the problem," Tyler said, his voice steady. "But we don't want to be anymore. We want to stand with Micah, with all of you. We want to be part of the solution." Micah watched as the room reacted. The shock was evident on the faces of the administration. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the students, especially the football team, to stand with the protesters. Principal Harrison cleared his throat. "This is highly unorthodox," he said, his tone biting. "And I'm not sure what game you're playing, but it's over now. You've caused enough disruption. You can't expect to walk away from this without consequences." Micah's pulse quickened. "We're not playing games," he said, his voice louder now, more certain. "We're fighting for what's right. And if you think you can shut us down with threats and fear, you're wrong." He glanced at the students around him. This was the moment to unite them all, to make them feel like they had the power. "This isn't about us getting suspended. It's about you listening. It's about you acknowledging that we have a voice and we deserve to be heard." Ms. Warner stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "You think you're going to make us change our entire approach based on a protest?" "Not just a protest," Micah responded, his voice steady. "A movement. You've underestimated us, and you're underestimating what we're capable of." The air in the room felt thick, charged with the energy of the students and the simmering tension of the administration. Everyone was watching closely, waiting for the next move. For a few moments, there was silence. Then Principal Harrison spoke again, his voice more measured, though still tinged with disdain. "We will take your concerns into consideration. But you must understand, this cannot go on any longer. If you disrupt the school again, there will be consequences." Micah nodded. He knew that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over yet, but this was the first time in a long while that it felt like they had won something. "We'll be here," Micah said, his words deliberate. "And we won't stop until things change." As the meeting concluded, students began to file out, their faces a mixture of uncertainty and hope. Tyler clapped Micah on the back, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had just accomplished. The football team began to disperse, but they were still standing with him. Rachel smiled faintly at Micah as they walked out of the gym together. "You did it," she said quietly. "We did it." Micah looked around, seeing the group of students who had been by his side from the beginning. They were tired, but there was a spark in their eyes. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, Micah felt like they had a fighting chance. They had stood up for what they believed in. They had made their voices heard. And nothing, not even the administration, could take that away. The morning after the showdown in the gym, the campus felt different. There was an air of quiet anticipation, a shift in the way people looked at each other. It wasn't the same school Micah had walked into just weeks ago. Everything had changed. Micah sat on the steps outside the school, the sun casting long shadows over the courtyard. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly on his notebook as he watched students trickle in. Some gave him nervous glances, others nodded with newfound respect. It was strange. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of the movement behind him or the still raw tension that lingered from the protests, but it was as if the school was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. A soft voice broke him out of his thoughts. "You okay?" It was Rachel, her smile tentative but warm. She sat down beside him, her presence grounding. "I'm not sure," Micah admitted, letting out a slow breath. "I feel like everything is hanging in the balance. We got through the meeting, but there's still so much left to do." Rachel nodded, looking out at the school grounds. "You've been fighting for change, Micah. That's not something that happens overnight. But what you started here. It's bigger than just you. It's bigger than all of us. Micah stared at the ground, his mind swirling with the weight of everything they had accomplished and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He had stood up for what he believed in. They all had. But the fight wasn't over. It never would be. Change was a slow process, and the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. I know, he said quietly, his voice full of resolve. But I can't stop now. This is just the beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. The school board's decision came down faster than expected. While the protests hadn't been entirely endorsed, the administration had promised to reevaluate their policies and create a new platform for student voices. Micah, Rachel, Tyler, and the rest of their group became known as the leaders of change, a label that both thrilled and terrified them. They weren't done. The school hadn't fully embraced the ideas they'd fought for, but the cracks were starting to show. Micah began attending student council meetings, working with other students, including those who hadn't been part of the protests but were now ready to listen. He wasn't just fighting for his own cause anymore. He was part of something larger, something that could change the entire school culture, maybe even the community beyond. Tyler, who had once been the voice of opposition, became a key ally. The football team, alongside several other student groups, helped ensure the momentum kept building. Their actions spoke louder than any protest could have. It was the unity that had never been seen before, united by a common cause. But it wasn't easy. There were still students who resisted, teachers who held grudges, and administrators who were reluctant to truly open up. They had made progress, yes, but the journey was far from over. Micah knew that it would take continuous effort, patience, and most importantly, collaboration. One afternoon, as Micah and Rachel walked through the hallways, they came across a bulletin board filled with flyers and posters for various student events. At the top of the board, a new banner hung proudly, Voices of Change, a student forum. Micah's heart swelled with pride as he read the flyer. The forum was the very thing they had fought for, a space where students could speak out, share their ideas, and be heard. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. This is it, Micah said, a sense of calm finally settling over him. This is what we've been working for. Rachel smiled, but her eyes held a mixture of exhaustion and pride. We did it. All of us. They stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of the flyer. It was a symbol of what had changed, what they had fought for, and what they would continue to fight for. As the semester came to a close, Micah realized how far he had come. He was no longer the quiet kid in the back of the room, invisible to everyone around him. He was a leader, and he had earned that role not through force or anger, but through resilience, passion, and the unwavering belief that things could be different. Walking into the next semester, there was a new sense of excitement in the air. The forum was just the beginning. Micah knew that they could build on it, creating new opportunities for students to engage, to speak out, and to make real, lasting change. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged, like he had a place in the world, and it was one where his voice mattered. Micah stood at the front of the student council meeting one afternoon, looking out at the faces of the students gathered before him. There were some familiar faces, those who had been with him from the start. But there were others, too. New voices, new ideas. The movement was alive, and it was bigger than just the protests. It was a part of something more significant. We've been through a lot to get here, Micah said, his voice steady and confident. But this is just the beginning. We've fought for our voices to be heard, but now, we need to keep pushing. We need to make sure the next generation has the same opportunities we're fighting for now. And we need to hold the school accountable to the promises they've made. The room was quiet for a moment, and then someone spoke up. It was Carlos, his voice carrying across the room. We're in this together, Micah. You've shown us that our voices matter. We're ready to keep pushing. Micah nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. He had his friends, his allies, and even some unexpected support. It wasn't going to be easy, but he had learned that nothing worth fighting for ever was. As the meeting continued, Micah's thoughts wandered to the future. There was so much work to do, so many battles to fight. But for the first time, he felt like they had a real chance of making lasting change. Change didn't happen overnight. It wasn't instantaneous. It was messy, it was difficult, and sometimes it felt like they were taking one step forward and two steps back. But Micah had learned that it wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey. It was about the people who stood with him, who fought alongside him. It was about knowing that even when the world seemed stacked against you, your voice could still make a difference. The fight was far from over, but it was a fight Micah knew he would continue for as long as it took. Because he had learned one thing above all else, there was power in being heard. And the movement? It was just beginning. The school year was drawing to a close, but for Micah and his friends, the journey they had embarked on was far from over. It was a strange feeling, watching the days on the calendar tick away. Every passing day felt like both a victory and a reminder of the long road ahead. The weather had warmed, and the school grounds, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now seemed quieter. But there was an underlying hum in the air, an unspoken energy that came with the change that had begun. It wasn't dramatic or instant, but it was real. Students were talking about things that mattered, about injustice, about fairness, about a future where their voices could actually make a difference. Micah leaned against the wall in the hallway, watching the students file past. There was a part of him that still couldn't believe what they had accomplished. It had all seemed impossible at first, facing down a system that had ignored him and everyone like him for years. But now, things felt different. People were listening. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make the change real. Rachel walked up beside him, her smile bright but tinged with exhaustion. "It's crazy," she said, following his gaze. "I still remember when we first started. It didn't feel like anything would change. And now? Now, I can't imagine it being any other way." Micah nodded. "I think we've finally gotten them to listen. But we can't stop now. This is just the start. We need to keep pushing." Rachel grinned. "Of course. We're not done yet. But I think, for the first time, we're on the right path." A few days later, Micah stood in front of the school's student council once again. It had been a few months since they had first rallied together, and the difference in the room was palpable. The council was no longer just a group of people stuck in a system they didn't understand. They were leaders now, fighting for what was right, pushing for change. Micah felt a surge of pride as he looked around the room. Tyler, who had once been the football team's captain and the person least likely to speak out, was now sitting beside him, a quiet but strong presence. Carlos and Rachel were there too, each of them lending their voice to the cause. The council wasn't the same as it had been before. It had grown, expanded into something bigger, something with purpose. "Okay, everyone," Micah said, his voice steady and clear. "We've made a lot of progress. The student forum is up and running. We've got more students involved than ever before. But we can't rest on our laurels. We need to make sure that this change sticks. We need to ensure that future generations have the same opportunities to make their voices heard." Tyler stood up next, his usual confidence now matched by a deep sense of conviction. "We've spent months working on this," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "But it's not enough to just create a space for people to speak. We need to take it further. We need to ensure that these conversations aren't just talk. We need action." There was a murmur of agreement in the room. Micah watched as the students around him nodded, their faces focused. They were ready to keep going. "We've already taken steps to make the administration more accountable," Rachel added. "But we need to keep pressuring them. We need to make sure that the changes we've fought for don't fade away once the noise dies down. And we need to make sure the next group of students who come through here have a stronger foundation to build on." Micah's heart swelled with gratitude. He had started this journey feeling like an outsider. But now, as he looked around the room, he realized that they were all in this together. They had created something bigger than any one person. The student body was starting to rally behind the cause. The forum had been a success, students from every grade had shown up, eager to have their voices heard. It was still in its early stages, but there was a momentum that couldn't be ignored. Teachers, too, were beginning to take note. Some were still reluctant to change, but many had joined the movement, seeing the potential for growth and improvement within the school. Even the administration had started to make concessions. They weren't fully on board, but they were listening more intently than they ever had before. Micah had spent hours in meetings with Principal Harrison and Ms. Warner, pushing them to take action. The discussions were difficult and sometimes heated, but they were progress. And for the first time, Micah felt like he was being treated as an equal, not just a student with complaints. But Micah knew that this was just the beginning. The changes they had made were important, but there was still so much more to be done. He could feel it in his bones. The system was still flawed. The problems still ran deep. But at least now, they had a foundation. They had a voice. As the school year neared its end, Micah found himself reflecting on how much had changed. He had gone from being the quiet kid in the back of the room to someone who was making real, tangible change. The people who had once mocked him, ignored him, or written him off as nothing more than a troublemaker were now looking to him for guidance, for leadership. He didn't know everything. He wasn't perfect. But he had learned that sometimes, you just had to step up and speak out, even when you didn't have all the answers. And the movement he had started? It wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had joined him along the way. It was their collective effort, their collective voices, that had made the difference. On the last day of school, Micah stood at the edge of the campus, watching the students filter out of the gates. He could see the same faces that had been with him from the beginning, Carlos, Rachel, Tyler, and so many others, smiling as they made their way out. They had fought for change, and they had won. It wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. Micah felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Principal Harrison standing behind him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Micah wondered what he was going to say. But Harrison didn't speak right away. Instead, he just nodded. "You did good," Harrison said quietly. "You and your friends, you made a real difference." Micah blinked, surprised by the words. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft. "We're not done yet, though." The principal looked at him for a long moment, and then, with a small nod, he walked away. Micah smiled to himself. He hadn't expected that. But it was a sign. The change wasn't just coming from the students. It was starting to ripple through the entire school. And even if it was just a crack, it was enough to let the light in. As Micah walked away from the campus for the last time that year, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, and there would be challenges. Of that, he was sure. But he had learned that the fight for change didn't end when you won one battle. It was about continuing to stand up for what was right, continuing to push for better, for fairness, for equality. And for the first time, Micah felt hopeful. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore. He was someone who had a voice. And that voice? It was going to keep pushing, keep fighting. Because the world was listening now, and they had a responsibility to keep making it better. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?